The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Excellent. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, Planet of the APIs, Monitoring Transactions in the Wild. This webinar is hosted and sponsored by Catchpoint and DevOps.com. My name is Peter Salidas, and I'll be your moderator today. In today's webinar, we'll be going over an introduction to APIs, including how they work, real-life applications, and API monitoring foundations. We'll also be diving into API transaction testing tutorials and also covering advanced monitoring tips and tricks. Today's presenter will be Robert Castley, Senior Performance Engineer at Catchpoint. Robert is a web performance specialist, web developer, and all-around good-looking geek. He's been optimizing web page performance for years and specializes in APIs, CSS, JavaScript, HTML5, XML, web design, UX, and performance. Whew, Renaissance man. So that was a mouthful. So without further ado, I'm going to actually, before I switch over to Robert, I just want to let you guys know that after the formal presentation, Robert will stay on the line to answer all of your questions. So if you do have one during the talk, please type it into the question window in the GoToWebinar control panel on your right, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end during the Q&A portion. But also throughout the presentation, we'll be kind of pumping the brakes a little bit and allowing you time to ask questions about specific sections. So at any point, if anything in the presentation sparks your interest or sparks a question, just type it in, and we might be able to get it either during the presentation or after. So don't be shy. Great, so without further ado, I'm going to pass you off to Robert Castley. Robert, let me know if you can click through the deck, and he's going to take you through the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm pleased to be your host for this webinar on APIs. Today, we're going to go through a short deck presenting to you what are APIs and how you can go about best monitoring them. So Peter, if you could just hand over control, please. Thank you. So what are APIs? For those not so familiar with APIs, APIs basically are a lot of the glue of the internet and that we know today. Probably every day you probably use an API without potentially realizing it. So APIs allow systems to talk to one another in a very efficient manner and a simplified manner, basically requesting information and getting information back and then taking action upon that information that they get back, and alternatively posting information or putting information into a backend somewhere, which then in turn can iterate other actions. And these APIs can be multi-step as well, whereby one action will trigger a response, and based on that response, you then have to trigger another action. So these APIs are truly, truly powerful, and more APIs are becoming prevalent in today's web application world. So APIs in the wild, I talked about the fact that you probably use them every single day. So, common examples of where you see APIs being used today are in payment gateways, whereby you're on an e-retail or e-commerce site and you're about to check out of the store and you hit that payment button and your credit card balance goes up, and then your payment is then sent over the wire using APIs. It could be with social media, interacting with social media, whether you use tools like Twitter or Facebook, or you use tools like Buffer that will automatically post news items to all your social media channels on your behalf. All the tools like this are using APIs every single day. It's the same with tools like Salesforce and Slack. People integrate with Salesforce. People build integrations for productivity tools like Slack. You see these integrations, they are all using the APIs that these guys publish. So how do APIs work? Well, traditionally they work over HTTP or HTTPS, and the formats that are most commonly used today are text, XML, or JSON, and you're able to basically communicate with these APIs using what we call like put or post or get. So we're either going to be sending information down or getting information back. You can control these APIs with headers, so you can determine how you're going to interact with these APIs as well. And the two most common methods are SOAP or REST, which we'll come on to in a little bit more detail shortly. Also with these APIs, you can post data down, so you can have a post data box where you can basically input additional data that is going to control the behavior, the response of the API. So you're probably all familiar with the data structures. Bottom left, we have a atypical XML data structure, which is quite easy to read. But more and more we're seeing people move to the JSON method of data structure, which is the example on the right-hand side of the screen. Both are equally as good. Probably the payload is a little bit less with JSON. As a developer, I prefer JSON. I find it easier to parse, I find it easier to read, I find it easier to format, etc. But again, it's everybody's own personal preference, not just personal preference, but also, you know, architecture preference as well. So I mentioned SOAP and REST earlier. The two most common methods today are SOAP and REST. SOAP is quite a heavy payload because you have to build out an envelope at the top of your request, and then everything comes back in XML. It can get quite hairy scary. This was, you know, in my days of yore, the sort of like preferred method of API transactions. But more and more, we're seeing REST-based transactions become more prevalent in the web development community. Probably because they're easier to construct, they are URL-based. You can very easily interact with a API just by sending down a URL with a query string appended to it. That saying, you can obviously also post data in the body as well if you wanted to. So it is becoming more and more popular and over SOAP with the REST API.
Great, we're going to just pause for a second to take any questions about the introduction to API monitoring. So if anybody has any questions, just let us know and we'll get to it right now. We did actually have one question about which is more popular, Robert, among your customers, REST or SOAP, but I think you covered that pretty briefly. If you have anything more to expand there, we'll go over that, but we'll see if any more questions come in, or else we'll just move on with the presentation.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I haven't actually assisted in a SOAP-based API monitoring scenario for some time now. I mean, everything that I've had land on my desk has been REST-based, and the REST-based transactions that, or API monitoring scenarios that I've come across, they have comprised of authentication. So, you know, we see more and more there is an authentication layer inside of these APIs. So with the REST-based API, we can construct OAuth authentication as part of the transaction, which in turn returns a token, and then that token is then used to further validate additional requests against that API. And I think, you know, SOAP-based APIs, yes, they still exist. They are obviously still out there, but most API scenarios that I come across these days, it is RESTful based.
Excellent. We had a piggyback question on it. I think you touched upon it briefly, but which is more secure, REST or SOAP?
Oh, everything is only as secure as the platform it's running on. Obviously, you know, people go to great lengths to secure their APIs. I guess RESTful APIs are probably more prone to injection, I guess. I'm not a security expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it does all hem on the platform on which it's running, because obviously it requires a web service of some description, so you have to secure the web service layer. If there is the possibility of injection, you obviously have to take that into account, that people can't pass malicious query strings down that can then obviously, you know, they can hijack or break into the back end somehow. So I'm not a security expert, but basically I would say that anything that's public on the web today is at threat.
Great, and we had a couple questions come in, and for the sake of time, we're probably going to to breeze through some of these questions and save them to the end. But I guess a couple of really good ones. So I guess I'll just briefly touch upon this next one. Which are there industries that tend to use SOAP? Specific industries that tend to prefer SOAP over REST? Could it even be broken out by industry or use case?
So from my experience, and I'm talking from this side of the pond over in the UK, banking and finance still tend to lean on the SOAP side of the fence. But with new regulations coming into play, they are slowly moving over to RESTful-based API transactions. Anybody that's a tech startup has already implemented RESTful-based APIs. They don't want the complexity or the overhead of SOAP. I see streaming services, I see, news, weather, B2B type activities whereby they are using RESTful-based APIs.
Excellent. And there was a couple more questions, but I'm sorry for those who asked fantastic questions, but we're going to have to save them for the end if we have time. So we're going to move right along. Thank you, Robert, for answering those questions. So I'm going to continue the presentation now and go into API monitoring. Take it away.
Thank you. So we're going to talk about monitoring APIs here and why it's important to monitor APIs. I mean, APIs, whenever you're on a web page and it stalls or you get stuck or you can't complete a particular action you're doing, it could be down to an API that is lying underneath somewhere. It could be a third-party component, it could be a payment gateway, it could be something that's dynamically updating the page for you. All these little API interactions can have a negative impact on an end user experience. So by not just monitoring web pages in general, it's also a good idea to monitor those APIs and monitor them frequently to be able to catch these issues as and when they occur a lot quicker than you would with traditional web page monitoring. And with that, you can be more reactive and proactive in fixing the issues or notifying your customers of an issue, putting up a little holding page while you sort out the issues. But you can also sort of like get clever with your API monitoring and also get into the realms of validation and multi-step transactions, which we're going to come on to a little bit more as we go deeper into this presentation. So what is API monitoring and why is it important? So the number one thing about any API is its uptime. It's got to be up, it's got to be available, it's got to be there. Second most important thing is the performance. How quickly does that API respond? So you send a request, how quickly do you get a response back? Then there's, I've touched on it already, about multi-step transactions whereby you may initiate a request, you get a response back, and then based on that response, you then have to take a second, third, fourth action. A good example that I like to give in that scenario is that if you're all familiar with any mobile application that you may have on your phone that you want to order some food tonight, well, the first question it asks you is your zip code or postal code. So you pop in your zip or your postal code, it's going to respond back with restaurants within that area. You then want to select your restaurant. So you then hit the button and you select your restaurant. Another API call goes out, comes back with the menu, and so on and so forth. So these sort of like multi-step transactions, you can validate each part of your API is working. Along with that, you want to be able to validate the responses that are coming back. So you may send a request down for weather in the UK, and you want to ensure that it always comes back gloomy, wet, and miserable, because that's what it is like over here, even today in the middle of summer. You want to also monitor your response times. You want to also get alerts when there are issues. You want to get those alerts come in, via email, SMS, or maybe, integrate with a third party. And you might also want to consider testing your APIs early, whether it's in testing or staging environments before they go into production as well. So I'm going to talk about, a simple, about API transactions. With the catch point tool, we use a subset of the Selenium language, and we've also expanded Selenium with our own verbs and also macros that allow us to manipulate things as we're going through an API journey. The scripts are created manually, and I'm very proud to announce that the screenshot that you see on the right-hand side there is the result of a hackathon event that we ran internally at Catchpoint, and the resultant screenshot there is actually a language plugin for the Atom editor that fully supports the Catchpoint Selenium scripting functionality. This allows it to provide you with, some wonderful colored syntax highlighting, along with what's called snippets in Atom that allow you to, as you start typing in commands, it gives you help and context regarding that particular command or verb that you're typing into the editor. So you can edit the scripts outside a Catchpoint, or you can edit them inside a Catchpoint, but depending on what your environment's like, how many API tests that you will be creating, etc. We provide the best of both worlds. You can manage it within the portal or externally outside of the portal as well. So just to walk you through a typical API transaction, this is a two-step transaction, and I'll just walk you through it very, very quickly. The first line, the open line, is actually doing a post. It's opening an endpoint, and it's indicating that we're going to be posting something to that endpoint. We then set a couple of headers that are required with this particular API request, and this is data that is gathered from the prospect or the customer. We then need to post some data down. So in this case, it wasn't an appended query string. This is where we had to post data in the body. And in this case, it was a username and password. We can then validate the response that we get back. So in this case, we want to check that the response that comes back is a 200 response and nothing else from the back end. The response that we get back, we then want to extract some information. And from this, in this example, we want to extract two bits of information, the DR session ID and the CID. So using a bit of regex here, we can extract those values, and we're going to store them in a variable called DR session and CID. Moving on to the second step, we're then going to open up a second endpoint. And with that endpoint, we can see part of that endpoint, we have the query string on the end there is to get a PDF file, but we're only going to be able to get that PDF file if we set some headers. And we need to set the DR session ID and the CID, and we do that by pulling in the variables that we have extracted from the previous step. So this is quite, a complex example, but it just shows you how flexible, the API scripting capabilities are. And it also shows you, that you can go, it's not just hitting an endpoint and is the endpoint up, it is we're communicating with the endpoint, we're talking with the endpoint, we're getting responses back, we're using those responses to be able to formulate subsequent requests to the API endpoint in question.
Excellent. So we're gonna take up another pause here. So Robert, we actually had a question come in, but I'm cheating a little bit because I know we cover this. I think it's actually even on the next slide. So if anybody has any questions about the API transaction scripts that you saw, any specific questions for Robert that is related to your business or any projects that you're working on, now is the time. We have a couple of minutes to take a brief bit to answer some of those questions before we move on. All right, so I'm tracking the question bar. We're not seeing any new questions come in, so I'm actually just going to ask that question. And so if anybody, if it gets time to ask their question as we move on, we can take another pause and answer those questions. So, for the next couple minutes, feel free to ask your question about API transactions, how to create those scripts, and then we can answer those. But I'm going to move on to the one question that we did have that takes a nice segue to the next slide. So, Robert, how do you go about debugging API issues?
Ooh, very, very good question. So there's two parts to this. There is the part of debugging an API before you put it into monitoring production. And then, as this screen shows, it's the debugging when you are monitoring. So the way that I debug APIs before I go into monitoring production is that, I create using tools like putrecs, whereby I can send a request to an endpoint to make sure that what I'm sending down is indeed what I'm expecting to send. Because sometimes when you're trying to construct these, you're trying to get your headers correct, you're trying to get your post body data correct. You want to make sure that what you're sending down when it lands at the other end is exactly what you're expecting to send. So using tools like putrecs, for example, is a great way to sort of like just, first of all, debug what it is you're sending is going to be the correct information. You can then debug directly as well, is that once you've got your API request or transaction all formulated and it's all good, you can then basically use an instant test feature whereby you can just quickly test it and make sure that what you're sending down, you're going to get a valid response back, your HTTP 200 is okay, and also validate the response data that's coming back. So that is, prior to going into monitoring production, those are two steps that you can do to very easily validate your API request or transaction. Then when it gets into monitoring production and you suddenly start seeing issues, or your transaction breaks for some strange reason, you can very easily delve into the headers and the actual response you're getting back. And we're depicting that on the right-hand side of this slide by enabling the facility to capture headers and responses. And this allows you to sort of like just suddenly see, hang on a minute, I was requesting this and I was getting back that, but now I can see that I'm no longer getting back what I expected because the endpoint is now returning something different. So you can very easily just dive in and get into the response and the headers to ensure that everything is as it should be. So, it could be that an API endpoint has changed version. It could be that the API endpoint is returning differently constructed JSON or XML, or it could be that the JSON is returning a value that you're no longer expecting and thus can't, proceed in the second or third steps of your API transaction. So there is full, debugging capabilities pre-monitoring production and post-monitoring production. So some advanced tips and tricks. I've already introduced you to the Selenium scripting language. Verbs, I've already talked about. This allows you to basically control the steps of the script, whether you are opening an endpoint, whether you're setting a header, whether you are posting some data, whether you are storing variables, whether you are asserting responses. There are, all these verbs available for you to basically build out your API monitoring scenario. We have macros. These allow you to basically be a little bit more clever with your APIs, whether this is extracting values from a page, or sorry, from a response, or whether it's storing those responses as a variable for use later on, whether it's posting data down. You have these macros available to you. There are other macros available like base64 encoding. This is part, a key macro in OAuth authentication. We have date timestamps in case you need to manipulate the dates and times that you're passing down so you can future-proof your API transaction. There are a myriad of macros available, whether it's, we also have encoding macros, not just base64, but other encoding macros as well. And one of the key ones that we've got is what we call a global variable. And this basically allows you to make an API request to an endpoint. You're going to get a response back, and you can store that response and make it global to any other API test or transaction that you have. And this allows you to basically have a master monitoring endpoint that may be getting an authentication token back, but you don't want to apply that logic to every single test that you're running. You want to have one that's doing the hard work and getting this authorization token, storing it as a global variable, and then that's going to refresh it every 30 minutes, for example. Then your other API tests can use this global variable, get the authorization token to make their calls. So they become just single-step transactions, for example, without having to be multi-step and adding all that additional weight to your API testing. That means that if anything on the authentication layer changes, it's only one place to change it. You don't have to go and manipulate all other or modify all other test types. We then also have a function called Insights, and Insights allows you to basically capture custom metrics or data. And this is where we can scrape data from the headers or the response of the content that we're getting back. A good example of this is that you might have an API call. I'm going to go back to my little restaurant scenario, whereby you search for restaurants and for a given zip or postal code. And the number of results that you get back for a given zip or postal code, for example, is 50. So you can scrape the number of search results returned, and you're going to store that value as 50 within the platform. That is then stored as an indicator in this case, because it's a numerical value. You can then, within the platform, alert that if this numerical value drops, you need to be alerted, because all of a sudden the API is not returning the correct number of search results for the given postal code or zip code. It may have gone up, it may have gone down, but if it's gone up, it's probably not too much of a concern. But if it's gone down, then it is a concern, because if you're in the business of promoting restaurants that people want to buy, get takeaways delivered from, there are restaurants no longer appearing with those search results, and you've obviously sold this search facility to those restaurants, and they're not appearing on those search results. They're not going to be very happy. So with Insights, it's extremely powerful. You may have your API load balance across different servers. You could capture the name of the server that served up the response, and therefore you can basically capture performance metrics and uptime metrics from each of those servers to see if any particular server is causing a problem, because you may be seeing, every now and again there's slow API responses or slow API calls. You can very easily then potentially focus in on a given server to say, hang on, this particular server is causing us problems. Let's go and investigate this server and find out why it's not performing as well as the other servers within our infrastructure. That's just a couple of scenarios of the power of Insight, the ability to be able to capture custom metrics and data. JSON parsing, I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar the fact that I prefer JSON. So just because it's my personal preference, we can put the slide in here. So with this, when I first joined Catchpoint, we had to basically go through JSON using regex, which was painful to say the least. But more recently, we've added support for JSON Path, which allows me to interact with JSON responses in a lot easier fashion. It's almost like XPath, if people are familiar with XPath. It basically allows you to parse through JSON data much easier and be able to extract information from JSON that you might want to use in subsequent API calls. And in the example here, we're basically looping through a JSON response to be able to extract the ISBN number that is referenced in the JSON data structure and store it in a variable called book that we can then use further down within our API transaction. And if you're curious about JSON Path, you can go to jasonpath.com and see more information and examples on using JSON Path.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Robert. Actually, I missed a couple questions a little earlier, so if you don't mind answering those before we get to the kind of the open Q&A forum,
Sure.
That would be great. So there was one question about how much unit testing is needed, or how is it important in API development?
Oh, that's a very good question, and that's quite a broad and wide and long question. I mean, anything that goes out into the public domain is going to need, testing and testing and testing and testing. I mean, APIs, whilst they're probably pretty simple, you've got to ensure that, your documentation is accurate, because obviously people are building against these. They're not familiar with these APIs, and it is always frustrating when people are, using APIs that they think they've got their query right, they think they've constructed everything, yet they still get back a 404 or a 500 error because the query is invalid. It is hugely frustrating to do that. As far as actually testing against your own APIs, I mean, obviously you will have done all your testing in, staging before you go into production, but this is where the monitoring is key. And I've covered off a few use cases throughout this webinar whereby, monitoring APIs is absolutely critical. I mean, one of my favorite API calls that I see nearly every day is on websites whereby you have to put in your zip or postal code as you're completing the form, and then you do that, then the next box down is listing out house numbers and street names, and you have to select your house number and street name from the drop down. If that API call breaks, that form breaks. It is, these people are using third parties where they're doing zip or postal code lookups, anything like that. You've got to ensure that it's responding quickly. I mean, the key thing with APIs is response and uptime. If APIs are responding slowly, it's going to negatively impact any experience on any web application. It's going to distract users, and they're going to become extremely frustrated. And APIs, more and more are building out the web applications that we use today and our mobile applications as well.
Excellent. So there's a ton of great questions in. So I'm glad we have enough time on the back end of this webinar to go over some of them. So we're going to try to answer as many as we can, Robert, before we have to head out, and give you guys back maybe a little bit of time. But one that came in: when you're monitoring an API, how do you ensure that it's sending back the correct data?
So with that, I don't know if I think I covered it off, is that within the monitoring tool suite that we provide, there is what's called the assert verb. And the assert verb can not only just assert, response codes, it can assert content. So you can, basically assert the content that's been returned is indeed what you're expecting. So I think I jokingly mentioned about the fact, querying weather for the UK as being gloomy and miserable. As long as you query the weather for the UK and it comes back cloudy with the word cloudy in it, that that's a valid response. If it comes back sunny, that you're no longer in the UK anymore. So, that would be an invalid response in that jovial scenario.
Excellent. So there's a couple questions that came in that mentioned mobile, so I'm just going to consolidate and just kind of ask a more broad question. So could some of these techniques be used to test mobile applications?
Absolutely. Most mobile applications that you have installed on your tablet or smartphone today will be using APIs underneath to basically give you that mobile application experience. If you're using like a travel application and you're going to be searching for, let's say you're looking for hotels for a given date, I can guarantee the response that comes back for those hotels for a given date is going to be an API response that is basically detailing, the hotels available within that given date. Whether it's searching for trains, whether it's searching for car hire, whether it's searching for restaurants, all these mobile applications under the hood are making API calls to a back end. And so when you're looking like at a mobile application, you want to monitor a mobile application, one of the key things that you should be thinking about is actually monitoring the API calls that that mobile application is making. Because if those API calls are unresponsive, or if they're returning incorrect data, or if they're completely unavailable, then your users of that mobile application are not going to be having a very good experience on the other end. I mean, I see it, I have on my particular smartphone, I have a casino application, and there's nothing more frustrating than I get the message that the back end is down and I'm no longer able to play slots on my favorite game just to pass the time. So every time that I spin the wheel, every time I increase my bet, there are API calls going on the back end there that are communicating with the game that I'm playing. So it doesn't matter, I know other technologies are out there now that people are looking to adopt as they try to improve the gaming experience or the online experience, but predominantly in weather applications, in travel and leisure, dining, sports, etc. These applications are using APIs underneath, and by monitoring those APIs, you can ensure that your mobile applications are up and running. You don't necessarily need to monitor a physical phone with the application on it, because the underlying architecture of that mobile application is going to be using API calls.
Fantastic. And I've been answering privately to some folks who are wondering about the presentation, but the recording and slides will be available on devops.com later this afternoon. We're also going to be emailing those to you guys. So just to answer out loud before we go on to the next few questions. So Robert, one question was, I know you mentioned it was not exactly your expertise, but how do you test your API for security?
I'm going to have to probably defer on that one, because like I declared earlier, I'm not a security
We have plenty
expert.
of security experts, so we can follow up with that question after with some of the more security folks at Catchpoint. But there's several more questions, so we'll dive right in. How does API monitoring fit into your overall strategy?
Anybody that has obviously got a web presence out there, whether they're using B2B, whether they're using third-party payment gateways. I mean, we've covered off quite a few scenarios today already. If you have built any web application and you are using your own APIs, so you're eating your own dog food, or whether you are using third-party APIs, monitoring those APIs, should play a key part in your overall monitoring strategy. If I take an atypical scenario that you are monitoring web pages, you are monitoring web transactions where you've actually, simulating user behavior within your web transaction, you want to have API monitoring in there as well, probably at a higher frequency, so you can catch API issues before they impact the web application. Well, they obviously, once an API issue surfaces, it is going to impact the web, any web transaction, but the quicker you can catch it, the better. Any slow API responses you want to be able to catch quickly, because if you are subscribing to a third-party API, and you probably see this a lot on the travel sites, like the comparison sites. I mean, they're making API calls all over the shop to various different providers of hotel accommodation or travel or car hire, etc. It's going to play a key part in their overall service to their end users. So monitoring APIs and making sure they're up and being responsive is critical to any business that is considering APIs within their web infrastructure.
Great. There were a couple questions that came in about the best tool for API monitoring, but we're not going to get into any kind of vendor comparisons. So I'll move on to something that will focus on Catchpoint that we've been talking about. The question was, how do you ensure that your API requests are correct in Catchpoint?
So I think I kind of touched on it, but with any API requests that you're building out, you're obviously going to be hitting an endpoint. You're going to either be appending a query string to that endpoint, or you're going to be posting some data down. I always run a little validation check using the free tools out there on the web, like PutRex, for example, that allows me just to validate what I'm sending. The headers are correct, the endpoint's correct, my post data is correct, it all looks good, the JSON's formatted correctly or the XML's formatted correctly, whatever I'm sending down, I validate that, I'm communicating okay. And then I tend to use our instant test to just validate that I'm getting a 200 response back. I can then also inspect the response content and ensure that the response I'm getting back is not an error message, it is actually some valid data that I'm getting back. And then with that, I can use that to ensure that the data I'm getting back is valid. And then the next step of my transaction might be that I need to extract a value from that. And basically it's a wash repeat cycle there. As I go through a multi-step scenario, I'm constantly just validating every single step as I go along. I mean, with any API, you can, I'm a bit of a sucker for using the command line. I'm a bit of a curl fan. I do like using curl, so I can actually, test it locally from my own desktop, so I can build out these queries as well. And basically, once I've built up my curl query, it's very easy to translate it into Selenium speak.
Excellent. So we have a few more, but we're going to be wrapping up a little early. Robert, are you familiar with service virtualization testing? I want to make sure that this is kind of in your wheelhouse before posing the question.
Ooh, I'm really sorry, but I would have to refer to Dr. Google on that one.
Okay, so there's a couple that we will likely follow up via email. We have the contact information, and so we can provide full answers to that, some of these questions that weren't answered in relation to API monitoring, and so we'll get to those after the webinar. But I think with that, there's a few other questions that we'll be responding to one-on-one, but we're going to wrap up the presentation. Thank you all so much for joining. Special thank you to DevOps.com for promoting the event. There were some fantastic questions that came in, a lot of great activity, which we really appreciate. For those unfamiliar with Catchpoint, we provide synthetic and real user measurement tools, of which include API monitoring, and you can explore some of those offerings on catchpoint.com. Also, just to repeat, we'll be hosting the deck and presentation on DevOps.com this afternoon, but we'll also be sending an email out with both the deck and presentation if you are unable to attend or want to send it around to your team. And with that, thank you again. Thank you so much, Robert, for taking us through the presentation. That was fantastic, and hopefully you all enjoy the rest of your day and week. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, Peter.